Hi, good morning ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jackie Blair and I'm the Secretary of the Environmental Law Society here at Florida Coastal. It is my honor to kick off the panel discussions this morning with chemicals in the environment. Please hold all questions until the end of all three presentations. Our first speaker is Professor Eric Hull. Professor Hull is an Associate Professor of Law here at Florida Coastal School of Law, where he teaches in Administrative Law, Environmental Law, Toxic Torts, Climate Change Law and Policy, Ocean and Coastal Law, and Property. He coordinates the environmental curriculum, the Environmental Externship Program, and serves as the faculty advisor to the Environmental Law Society. Professor Hull has published on a wide range of environmental law topics, with emphasis on the impact of pollution on marine systems, human health, and the environment. His articles have appeared in leading law journals and in texts covering international ocean governance, the impacts of climate change on ocean and coastal systems, environmental and animal law. His article on ocean acidification was nominated as one of the top environmental and land use law articles of 2014. He served as a litigation associate for Schwartz Campbell and as a judicial law clerk at Florida's 5th District Court of Appeals. He is admitted to practice law in the state of Florida as well as before the U.S. Supreme Court. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Hull.
Okay, well thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming to the Environmental Summit and sort of having a dual duty here today. This presentation, I think, will augment a few of the points that Professor Mintz made about where we are with certain regulations and how existing gaps still need to be addressed. So if you look at the topic today, public health and the environment, we have a number of environmental laws that are in place. I'm going to focus really today on TSCA because that is where the most recent activity in Congress is occurring. But in doing that, I want to sort of set a framework I think will be helpful with some of the slides. If you look at FIFRA, the statute that covers pesticides and Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and TSCA, understanding what they're trying to do in terms of setting policy is important. If you look at FIFRA deals with substances that are intentionally designed to kill things. And so there's an extensive registration process that allows for data collection and understanding of what those substances do. If you look at the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, some substances that are regulated, foods are considered safe, but food additives are not considered safe, so they're subject to regulations. Drugs that go into the body that are designed to cause some kind of physiological change, some type of response, go through incredible testing provisions. TSCA creates a little bit of a different problem, and the reason for that is because chemicals are ubiquitous in society. They are part of most of what we have. Some of those chemicals are hazardous, some of them are not. And so when you look at the way that TSCA has developed, it's important to understand both sides of the equation. One, the concern with regard to protecting public health and the environment from any of the hazards associated with chemicals, but also the concern about regulating chemicals that may not need to be regulated because they pose no risk of harm. So, looking back at the history, it's important, I think, to address a couple of key moments. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and the discussions that she had about how pesticides had been accumulated. Pesticides, synthetic chemicals, had been accumulating in wildlife and humans that cause harm, and her call to do something about that, to regulate chemicals in the environment. And what I think is particularly interesting is the pushback that followed from that, which is from the chemical industry. If we take this, what was considered to be an extreme stance of regulating chemicals to the point where you regulate them out of existence, what happens to society? Those two competing interests are really at play in TSCA. The interest in preventing harm and also protecting businesses, manufacturers, producers, distributors from unnecessary regulation that could actually cause harm. that could take useful products out of the stream of commerce. So beginning in the late 1960s, as we had this nascent environmental movement that Professor Mintz was referencing, there was concern about regulating chemicals within the environment. And so the President's Council on Environmental Quality started to have discussions on how do we do this. And a couple of points came out that are important. One, recognition that toxic substances were entering the environment in increasing volume, and that there really wasn't any current regulatory framework to deal with that directly. We had the framework for protecting effluent waste and emissions and controlling hazardous waste facilities and those, but protecting public health and the environment from before the substance gets into commerce, gets into the environment, was a different issue. And so for about 6 years, from the late 1960s to its final passage, there was disagreement related to the burden that should be imposed on manufacturers, distributors, producers in terms of what they would be required to provide and the testing that they would be required to do to allow, before the chemicals could be allowed onto the market. And so during that time, while this was stalled, there was a very interesting incident, the Capone disaster. Capone is a pesticide, and the workers were exposed to it, and the facility was actually dumping Capone into the river, in James River. And it created a tremendous uproar about not only the workplace safety, but also the controls associated with getting chemicals into the environment. For decades, Capone remained in the environment and continued to cause harm. And so those types of issues, along with some of the ones that Professor Mintz mentioned, led to a push to pass the Toxic Substance Control Act. What TSCA, in essence, tries to do is it tries to eliminate unreasonable risks of harm using the least burdensome approach. And in doing that, it's sort of a three-part balance in its simplest form. In order to do that, you have to consider the economic impacts of any regulation on a chemical. You have to recognize the societal impacts of that regulation. What does it mean to take that product off of the market? Is there a useful, safer alternative? What benefit will be denied society by removing or regulating that chemical? And the human health and environmental impact. So all three of these come into play when you look at efforts to eliminate unreasonable risk using the least burdensome approach. When you look at the concerns, and I'm sure that other speakers will talk more to this, but what are you trying to get at? You're trying to get at those types of chemicals that where there's evidence of carcinogenesis, mutagenesis, teratogenesis, those types of effects that are harmful. And so in order to identify those, you're looking for characteristics that are known, that are associated with those types of effects, like persistence and acute toxicity, etc. But in order to get that information, you have to go through testing. And the testing is multifold. I just list a few that are listed in TSCA here. Epidemiological studies, serial studies, in vitro studies, etc. So there is an understanding of what poses the risk and the characteristics that you should look for when you're examining a chemical, and the types of studies that are necessary to get that data. The problem is that TSCA, as written, creates this really strange catch-22. And it's part of the reason why there is a push now to consider amending TSCA. And it is because, with regard to existing chemicals, most of which were grandfathered in with TSCA, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, EPA can regulate those chemicals. They can impose regulations if they can find a risk. But the risk that is, in order to find that risk, there are a number of steps that the EPA must take. So first, the EPA has the burden, which is interesting how that was shifted. But in creating the risk, they've created this very high threshold for action, where the EPA has to show a hazard, that there is a risk, or that there is exposure, sometimes both. That the data that is currently available from the industry and available public sources is inadequate to actually assess the risk, and that testing is necessary to get the data that will be required. And that it makes sense, except that the manufacturers are not required to provide that testing data. And so in large part, absent that additional information, the EPA has been forced to look at publicly available database, consider chemical analogs that share the same chemical molecular structure to assess and compare to determine whether or not a chemical has properties that may pose risks through application. And so it creates this strange catch-22 where there is a desire to regulate. In fact, Section 2 of TSCA actually has an express provision saying that data should come from the manufacturers. But Section 4 and Section 5, related to existing and new chemicals, have different provisions. And the provision for existing chemical really places the burden on the EPA without allowing the EPA to actually go to the manufacturers and get the data that they need. And so there is this significant gap with regard to existing chemicals. And so why does that matter? It matters for this. There's a very interesting, this is, you know, we talk about the history of environmental law, but really you can bring it to today. 2014, there's a major spill of MCHM. It's a product that is used for coal washing in a number of different industries. It spills into the Elk River. It gets transported downstream into a water treatment facility. And through the water treatment facility, it's not treated, and the individuals in the community drink it. And the question that was immediately apparent is, what is the risk, and how do we respond to that? And when that question was asked, what was discovered really, I think, highlights the issue, the problem with TSCA. The manufacturer is required to produce a material safety data sheet. And on that data sheet that is provided for the workplace, so you understand the workplace exposure, what is missing is all of that key data that I just mentioned that EPA actually needs to really adequately assess the risk. So no data was provided on mutagenicity, none on whether it causes cancer or produces reproductive effects, etc. So when you see that, the gaps in TSCA become glaring. And there, you understand, I think, the need and the call for amending TSCA. So the way it's currently structured, at its inception, we already had approximately 62,000 chemicals that were on the market that were used in commerce for a multitude of purposes. And a decision was made at that point that these have been used absent existing data, absent data of unreasonable risk. They should be allowed to continue in commerce unless there is evidence of risk. And in the process of doing that, the question was raised: well, who should actually be responsible for providing that data? That risk, that burden was placed on the EPA. For new chemicals, those chemicals that came onto the market after TSCA, the regulations are a little bit more stringent with regard to protecting human health because they're not presumed safe. And they are subject to a number of provisions, one of which is a 90-day pre-manufacture notice for new chemicals or existing chemicals that are put to a significant new use. And in the process in this, the manufacturers are required to provide the data on health and environmental effects that they have currently in their possession, any data that they've accumulated, any data that they know or they should reasonably know, or can reasonably ascertain related to health risks. They have to provide that to the manufacturer, to the EPA. They also have to submit physical and chemical properties worksheets that establish certain properties or identify certain properties with the chemical structure, etc., that the EPA can then use and compare to other existing chemicals using chemical structures, using analogs to determine, to compare and assess whether or not those chemicals may pose a risk. If that information, with information available in public databases, suggests that there is a risk, then the EPA can propose an order requiring additional testing that may reveal additional need to regulate. Then the EPA can also issue a proposed rule to regulate if the risk is then identified. Absent that, through the 90-day period, the manufacturers will, through notice of commencement, will be able to put these chemicals into commerce, and they will effectively enter into that database. So since TSCA was enacted, approximately 22,000 of the roughly 40,000 new chemicals that were submitted have made it onto that list. So we're looking at a chemical substances inventory that has about 84,000 chemicals listed on it. And there has to be some way to prioritize the testing of those chemicals. And so a priority list has been created through this interagency testing committee, an independent agency, to identify certain chemicals that really warrant expedited review and expedited processing to try to get at additional information that may lead to the discovery of risk. At that point, the EPA administrator can publish a rule or require testing or a notice explaining why the test rule is not published. So in order to regulate, once you have the data, if you have data that suggests that there is an unreasonable risk of harm and that they should be subject to regulation, then the EPA has what I consider to be an extremely hard burden, and I think you'll see this in one of the cases. They have to show that the use of the chemicals will present an unreasonable risk, that the restriction represents the least burdensome regulation of all available alternatives to reduce the risk to a reasonable level. It's not a zero-risk statute. It is to a reasonable level, something that we are willing to accept. And that the benefits of the regulation outweigh the cost, and the cost being the economic cost, the societal cost, etc. And so, if the EPA decides to take that step, they have a range of options. They can impose a lower burden by imposing some kind of notice or labeling requirement, all the way up to a heavy burden of total ban or something in between. And as that burden increases, so does their burden of proof with the court. And the best example of this is one of the most interesting cases you'll read, I think, in environmental law, this corrosion-proof fitting case. And it shows you the difficulty of regulating this. EPA recognized through a review of about 100 studies that asbestos posed a risk of harm, and it was a carcinogen at all levels. And so they decided to regulate, and they didn't consider the risk level of intermediate regulation, something short of a total ban. What they proposed was a phased-out ban, eliminating asbestos almost in some. But they didn't consider the intermediate regulation, something in between, an alternative to asbestos products. And so what the court said in evaluating this is that you did not meet your substantial burden. You did not show that there was substantial evidence in the record that this rule was necessary and it was the least burdensome of all of the available ones. One other point, and I'm going to close in just a couple of moments, is other than the burden, there is an inherent disincentive within the industry to go through this testing. It's time intensive, it's costly, and the results of those tests may actually result in additional regulation. And so for some manufacturers, not all, but for some manufacturers that either disagreed with the scientific studies or in some other way disputed the evidence, would push through this process of delaying the regulatory action by challenging each step of the process. And an interesting example of that is this timeline for trichloroethylene. From 1977, banned by the FDA. 1987, the EPA takes a look at it and says it probably causes cancer. And then 2011, there is finally some action. And the end result is today, that chemical is listed as a carcinogen. Right? It took that long to get to that problem. So what are some of the key problems that are left? Well, EPA lacks the basic data on risk for many chemicals. It's only required testing for about 200 of the 62,000 existing chemicals. Of the ones that are currently regulated, 5 existing chemicals are regulated and 4 new chemicals are regulated. And so they're really pushed to regulate through a voluntary program. The state initiatives, because TSCA doesn't specifically preempt unless the chemical is covered under the Act, states have responded by enacting a multitude of acts that are sometimes inconsistent with one another. So it subjects industry to a number of different, oftentimes conflicting provisions that places a burden on manufacturers and changes the playing field in different states. And so there's been calls to do a number of things, one of which is to adopt a framework that is utilized in Europe, which is called REACH, and the primary difference is that it places the burden on the manufacturer itself to prove that the product is safe before it goes on. So they're taking this precautionary approach to prove that something is, or that it's unsafe until it's proven safe. And it requires the industry to provide the data and requires companies to develop and share that information. Last part, very, very quickly, I just want to share one point with you, just because I'm at time. There were two bills that were going through the last two legislative sessions. Both of them died, and they're trying to be renewed now. But there's two, the Senate Bill 696 and Senate Bill 1009. Both of them had provisions that attempted or would seek to amend provisions of TSCA. But the one that allowed for state preemption actually was the one that had the widest bipartisan support. The one that actually retained many of the provisions of TSCA, but allowed for state preemption and allowed for additional efforts with regard to data collection, was the one that garnered most support. But both of them failed. And right now there is push to renew that in Congress to see if we can get another bill passed. So that's where we're at. I would finish, but I'm right at time. I'm probably actually over, so I apologize. But thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Hull. Our next presentation for the panel discussion of chemicals in the environment is Professor Sonnenberg. Lucy Sonnenberg, PhD, is a research professor of chemistry and the research director of the Millar Wilson Laboratory for Chemical Research at Jacksonville University. Under her directorship, the multifaceted mission of the laboratory is to conduct novel research in environmental chemistry, provide rigorous and meaningful environmental research experiences to undergraduate students, and to serve as an environmental chemistry resource to area agencies and institutions, such as the Florida DEP and the St. Johns River Water Management District. Dr. Sonnenberg and her students have conducted research on chlorinated organic contaminants in water and sediment, bioavailability and bioaccumulation of contaminants, carbon and nitrogen cycling in natural and wastewater systems, and the effects of natural organic matter on pollutant fates and effects. In addition, the laboratory has performed numerous assessments of stormwater management technologies. She is a member of the National American Chemical Society and the Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry. She participates in the Lower St. Johns River Technical Advisory Committee and is also a member of the City of Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board, where she serves as the Air Committee Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sonnenberg.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and speak with you from a little bit different perspective about chemicals in the environment, and my thanks to Professors Hull and White for the invitation. Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that I'm going to be talking primarily today, and wave your hand if you can't see me. I know my voice tends to drop off sometimes. But I wanted to talk to you a lot about a project, a data analysis project I and some students of mine and colleagues been working on for several years, trying to get at this question of what are the chemicals of concern in the Lower St. Johns River Basin. Sounds like a pretty easy topic to address, a fairly simple idea. Turns out it's extremely complicated and difficult for many of the same reasons that Professor Hull just got done talking to you about. Chemicals differ, their releases into the environment differ, target organisms differ, and there are many, many, many other factors that make it very difficult to really assess what are the ones we need to be focusing on and that are of concern to us. So what we're trying to do today, what I'm trying to do today, is to tell you a couple of different ways to try to get at that question of what should we be concerned about in this area. The first, and probably a little bit the most lengthy approach, we'll be looking at sediment concentrations comparing the sediment quality guidelines. And the results of these analyses will give us an idea of overall environmental toxicity. And what I mean by that is essentially anything that's toxic to anything other than humans. And in this case, we're focusing on the organisms that reside in the sediments. A second kind of approach is looking at the chemicals that are actually released in the environment from point sources, from industrial facilities in the basin. It takes it from a different viewpoint, but it does have a lot of data compared to the sediments that we're looking at initially. We're looking at the releases with respect to total poundage using the EPA's Toxics Release Inventory database. And then I'm going to finish up briefly with some preliminary efforts we're taking to try to translate those TRI loadings into actual potential chronic human health risk to citizens in Duval County. So, starting with the sediments, why do we focus on sediments? There are a lot of good reasons. First of all, sediments tend to attract some really problematic chemicals due to the chemical properties of both those problematic chemicals in the sediments. Sediment organisms tend to accumulate those chemicals that reside in the sediments, and frequently they can serve as the base of a food chain as their predators consume them, and that is a pathway where the chemicals move up the food chain in the process of biomagnification. It's interesting to look at sediments because this is a cumulative assessment, and it comes from both point sources and unidentified non-point sources. And finally, it gives us an interesting profile of the history of contamination, at least with respect to the chemicals that tend to persist and stick around for long periods of time. So what our approach was in trying to get at this chemicals of concern in the lower basin is we compiled data from a number of different sources of 4 different classes of contaminants, and I'll go into more detail about that in just a moment. We reviewed the data, and then we organized them into a region of the river with similar land use patterns. And I'm going to take a moment to describe that to you if I can do it with the pointer without changing the slide. And sorry, the people over here are going to get it this time. I'll go back and forth. Sorry. So, oops. Or not. Okay. We have here Area 1, I'll talk about that in a moment. Area 2 is what I refer as the North Main Stem. This is the shipping and maritime industry region. Area 3, North Main Stem. This is urban Jacksonville. Area 4, South Main Stem. And that will characterize mainly as rural and agricultural areas. Very simplistic definitions, but I'll be referring to those throughout the talk, at least for a little while. The data came from disparate sources listed there in the second bullet item. I just want to note that there is an extensive data set from 1996 to 2003 established by the St. Johns River Water Management District and a comprehensive program to look at sediment contaminants in the basin. And it was the heft of this database that really allowed us to have enough information to make some statistically significant conclusions. Much of the earlier data came from the other sources listed there. We looked at potential toxicity effects and time trends. And I want to take a couple minutes to really explain that potential toxicity effects in detail, because it's kind of the heart of where our conclusions come from. Well, first of all, we have to consider that sediment often have sediment quality guidelines associated with it. There are a number of different types of guidelines. The ones that we selected for comparison were those established by McDonald et al. At Florida, and we also used from the NOAA's sediment quality guidelines established in 2008. The specific guideline we're comparing to is the probable effects level. Now this is the concentration above which, or at which, or above which we would expect there to be widespread adverse effects on sediment organisms. Pardon me. There are others, as I mentioned. You can have the adverse effects level, the no observable effects concentration, and the acronyms go on and on and on. But this is the one we're focusing on, and I'll also mention a threshold effects level, which is a much more protective sediment quality guideline, because that's the level at which very sensitive populations start exhibiting adverse effects. In compiling all of these guidelines, these refer to freshwater and marine macroinvertebrates. These are the target organisms, and not only are the toxic effects on individual organisms assessed, but also changes in a community structure. So there's a wide plethora of information that goes into establishing these guidelines, which we're comparing sediment concentrations to. The way we compare those sediment concentrations is simply to calculate a very simple parameter that we're calling toxicity pressure. No rocket science here, it's simply the concentration over the PEL, the probable effects threshold. We take the average of that, and it's fairly simply interpreted. Anything greater than 1, we're probably seeing adverse effects. And anything less than 1, that adverse effect is less well assured. We use this value to really compare the potential impacts of different types of chemicals, the potential impact of different classes of chemicals, and the relative pressure in different regions of the river. And that's why it's a useful metric to do that. The other thing we looked at was time trends. We use a standard Spearman rank coefficient linear regression between year and median annual concentration. So that's what we're doing, that's the groundwork. And we'll start with our first category of chemicals, which is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. A little bit of background, this is a very complex group of chemicals consisting of over 100 individual chemicals. Some of them are carcinogenic, and at the slide below you see 2 of the most clearly established human carcinogens, benz-A anthracene and benzo-A pyrene. There are natural and anthropogenic sources of PAHs. They are natural components of oil, coal, and tar. A fairly recent example in the media, of course, are the natural seeps that we learned about in the Gulf during the Horizon oil spill years ago. So that's certainly an example of a natural component. The other major source of PAHs in the environment are the combustion of fossil fuels and biomass. Clearly there are natural versions of that and anthropogenic versions of that. What we found with PAHs, again, I'm pointing out, if you look at the top graph, we've got Area 1, those poor western tributaries. Area 2, which I never explained in that other slide, sorry about that. Those western tributaries were pulled out of the main data set that you recall. You can see at the slide below that they're kind of disparate, and the reason they were pulled out because they had the unfortunate distinction of being so contaminated with some metals that they totally skewed all of the data analysis. So you'll see reference to the Area 1 western tributaries. These consisted of Trout River with its tributaries, the Sierra Ortega system, Rice Creek, and Big Fish Bear Creek. So, having backed up, I will go back to the PAHs, and we can see evidence. I'll go over here. This time, you have a high cumulative toxicity pressure in those contaminated tribs, but it's equally matched by a high toxicity pressure in the north arm, that north arm where there's high maritime and boating activity. So this clearly is an area of concern for PAHs, but if you look at the colors, don't worry about the chemicals on the right, just look at the colors distribution of Area 1 and Area 2. They're different. So the PAHs of concern of those two regions are different, which suggests there are different sources of those PAHs in those areas. In terms of trend, there were some notable observations. If you look at the middle of the graph, you see that there is this fairly marked drop-off in Area 3. That's the North Main Stem, urban Jacksonville. after the late 1980s for some of those PAHs. And we speculate that that's representing a recovery of a very big creosote spill in Deer Creek in the early 1980s. So that's very optimistic. On the other hand, if we look farther south and upstream of us, we starting to see a little bit of evidence of increasing concentrations of our petrogenic chemicals. Those are the ones that come from not combustion, but those natural oil and gas and tar. So it is not unreasonable to think that these types of chemicals would increase with increasing growth in population. Our next category of chemicals that we looked at were metals. Like the PAHs, they're naturally occurring, and they're varied widely naturally also. Their distribution and amounts will vary considerably just simply with the type of sediment it is. Human sources are primarily from coal combustion, industry releases, and hazardous waste sites. The 7 metals that we looked at in detail in this analysis were copper, cadmium, chromium, lead, silver, zinc, and mercury. The status with respect to the metals is a little bit different from the PAHs. If you look at the left-hand side of the graph, the maximum is not quite as high, and there seems to be more uniform toxicity pressure throughout the basin until we get way upstream into the agricultural and rural areas. If you look at the first column in that first graph, you can see the green portion of it, and that represents some significant zinc contamination in probably the Cedar River. We go to area 2 and we get a little bigger contribution from silver, but they're pretty equally distributed. For the toxicity pressure to the benthic organisms is pretty evenly distributed between those metals. In terms of trends, we saw a small increase again in area 3 of silver, cadmium, and zinc, and no other significant trends. I'm going to combine the last 2 categories in the interest of time, and also because they share some important attributes. These are the polychlorinated biphenyls and the organochlorine pesticides. One of the chief factors that made me bring them together is the fact that both they're man-made. There are no natural sources of these chemicals. So when we see them in the environment, we know that we put them there. They're highly persistent and they're toxic, and most of either manufacture or distribution was banned 40 or more years ago. So we shouldn't have been receiving too many, at least legal or known, releases into the environment since then. They share an attribute that there's a common transport mechanism is through the atmosphere. You may recall PCBs were used in transformers for heat control, lubrication. Organochlorine pesticides, well, they were used as pesticides for a wide variety of target organisms, and they include DDT, the notorious DDT, a number of other organochlorine pesticides, plus their toxic degradation products. What we see is that in the PCBs, they're widespread. 80 to 100% of the sediments that we analyzed that were analyzed had PCBs in them, but mostly they were below the PELs. Similar distribution for the organochlorine pesticides, except we see that the contaminated tribs area are suffering from the toxicity pressure way more so than the remaining sections of the river that I addressed. So we see multiple sediments stressors. PAHs are important in the main stem, and we see hot spots in a lot of the tributaries. The trends differ with the different chemicals, and we have persistent chemicals do remain, and we believe it's important to monitor the effects of growth and shipping. So now I'm going to do is follow in the wonderful footsteps of my predecessor, Professor Hall, and say, gee, I wish I could have told you about the rest of my talk, but I'm going to just close, and forgive me for doing this. But I'm going to tell you that in addition to those conclusions, what we find when we look at the toxics release inventory and then try to also take that a step further and look at toxicity loading into the environment, we see that total air emissions are declining, total water discharges into our rivers and streams are not declining. And finally, when we try to translate that into potential human health risk, we see that in Duval County, most of the risk is deriving from mercury releases from our point sources. Thank you very much. I apologize for the quick trip through the last several slides, and I'd be happy to take questions when there's an opportunity to. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Sonnenberg. Our third and final presentation for chemicals in the environment is from Ms. Jeannie Economos. Ms. Economos has worked for over 20 years on issues of the environment, environmental justice, indigenous and immigrants' rights, labor, peace, and social justice. From 1996 to 2001, she worked for the Farm Worker Association of Florida as the Lake Apopka Project Coordinator, addressing the issues of job loss, displacement, and health problems of the farm workers who worked on the farmlands on Lake Apopka prior to the closing in 1998. From 2007 until present, she has been the coordinator of the Pesticide Health and Safety Program of the organization, which includes annually training over 500 farm workers in Florida on their rights and protections in the workplace and how to protect themselves and their families from pesticide exposure. She is also engaged in local, state, national, and international coalitions and collaborations related to farm workers' rights, health and safety, pesticide reduction, sustainable agriculture, and food sovereignty. She is currently co-coordinator of the Lake Apopka Farm Workers Memorial Quilt Project, whose purpose is to raise awareness about the impacts of pesticides on the former farm workers of Lake Apopka. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Jeannie Economos.
So hopefully you all can you all hear me?
It's on, just speaking to it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, great. So how many people have heard of Lake Apopka? Oh my goodness. Okay, so hopefully this won't be old news to you. Do you know about the farm workers in Lake Apopka? No. I guess real quickly, just what do you know about Lake Apopka? Alligator studies? Okay. Okay, well, Lake Apopka is the fourth largest lake in the state of Florida. It used to be the second largest lake in the state until the 1940s, when the U.S. government came and was looking for land to grow crops for the war effort. So if you look, can everybody see the map okay? If you look at this map, all this area in yellow, except for this area right here, used to be the bottom of Lake Apopka. So Lake Apopka was a third larger than it is now. In the 1940s, the U.S. government gave the north shore of Lake Apopka to agricultural interests to grow crops for the war effort. So what happened was this area was drained and diked. There were pumps that were built to pump the water off of this marshland, and a dam was built to keep the water back so that this land could be exposed. It's a really rich organic material that they call muck, and it's very rich in nutrients for growing agricultural crops. So agriculture started on this area in the 1940s, growing mostly vegetable crops and lettuces and herbs. What did they use in the 1940s? We just heard from our previous speaker about DDT, Aldrin, Endrin, many pesticides. Florida has a different growing season than up north. So in Florida, our growing season is fall, winter, and spring, and we don't grow crops in the summertime because it's too hot. So what the farms did was, every year during the growing season, Water had to be pumped off of this land into the lake to keep this land dry to grow crops. Because remember, this is below lake level now. Okay? So, and then in the summertime it would be reversed. The water from the lake would be pumped onto the land to keep the weeds down and to stop the soil from oxidizing. So from the 1940s until 1998, we have a flow of water from the lake to the land and back again. Well, we know that in the 1940s and up until the 1960s and early 70s, they were using pesticides and fertilizers. Lake Apopka used to be a premier bass fishing lake in the 1950s. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, oh my goodness, the local governments were beginning to freak out because Lake Apopka was looking pretty horrible. What happened was the phosphorus from the fertilizers on Lake Apopka were going in, on the farmland, were going into Lake Apopka, causing massive algae blooms. Lake Apopka became a pea green soup color. And what happened is that the algae blooms would not allow light to penetrate. And so all the aquatic organisms on the bottom of the lake died. The fish died. The ecosystem collapsed, and Lake Apopka became an eyesore and was no longer a great tourist attraction like it had been in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and early 60s. So, moving right along, this is a very huge, complicated story that I'm trying to encapsulate in this short time. So this is continuing to happen. In addition, in Central Florida, you have a lot of citrus crops at that time until the 1980s. Citrus processing plants were dumping effluent into Lake Apopka. And down here at the south shore of Lake Apopka, the city of Winter Garden was dumping raw sewage into Lake Apopka. So we had a real mess. Finally, in the 1980s, Dr. Lou Gillette, who was a professor at University of Florida, was told to go do alligator studies. And so he came to Lake Apopka in the 1980s and was tooling around in his boat on Lake Apopka looking at alligators and was appalled at what he found. He found that alligators on Lake Apopka had very low reproductive rates. Male alligators had high estrogen levels, female alligators had high testosterone levels, birth defects among the alligators, and deformed sexual organs of the alligators in Lake Apopka. After much research, Dr. Lou Gillette finally determined that it was pesticides that were causing the problems on the alligators in Lake Apopka. If you can lift up the map a little bit. This is Gourd Neck Springs, which is the source of water for Lake Apopka, one of the sources, the main source of water for Lake Apopka. Right next to Gourd Neck Springs, there was the Tower Chemical Company. The Tower Chemical Company used to manufacture and distribute DDT and other pesticides. In 1979, there was a spill of DDT from the Tower Chemical Company into a holding pond that then went into the lake. Dr. Lou Gillette, after much study, determined that it was the pesticides, including the organochlorine pesticides that our previous speaker just mentioned, that were causing the alligator problems. He published his studies in the 1980s, and at that time, Dr. Lou Gillette was laughed at by scientists around the world because he said that the pesticides were causing endocrine disruption or hormone disruption of the alligators. His studies were discounted at that time, but Dr. Lou Gillette was one of the foremost scientists in the country that was opening up a whole new area of science that we know today applies to more than just pesticides in the environment, but all kinds of other chemicals also. And these are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and folks, we all have them in our bodies. Whether you were born when DDT was still legal or not, we all have them in our bodies. I'll have to do one real quick aside. They did studies of umbilical cord blood of newborn babies today. I think this was a couple of years ago, and they found over 240-something chemicals in newborn babies today in umbilical cord blood. We are all exposed to chemicals in the environment. Public health in the environment, Oh, yes. It is a public health problem. Okay, back on track. Okay, so Dr. Lou Gillette found these alligator studies. Okay, and again, today he's a known, respected internationally for his work on this. So moving right along, local governments are trying to figure out, oh my God, we got to clean up Lake Apopka. It looks so bad. We have Disney World now, and we have this horrible eyesore in the backyard of Disney World, so we have to clean up Lake Apopka. So all kinds of plans were put forth to try and clean it up. And finally, in the mid-1990s, the state of Florida said, okay, you know what, we're gonna just buy out all these farms, shut them down, and we're gonna restore this to natural wetlands and clean up Lake Apopka. So from 1996 to 1998, the St. John's Water Management District bought all these farms. $113 million of our taxpayer money went to buy out the farms on Lake Apopka. Okay? In that winter, 1998-99, the St. John's Water Management District flooded these lands to attract migrating waterfowl. These lands had not been flooded since the 1940s, when the farms were first created. 1998-99 was the worst bird death, one of the worst bird deaths ever in the history of the United States. Audubon Society was out here doing their Christmas bird count. Going, oh, look at all the white pelicans. And oh, look, oh, they're dying. The white pelicans are dying. At first, the Water Management District said that it was Newcastle's disease. It took the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 2 years to determine that it was toxaphene, which is an organochlorine pesticide in the same family as DDT, aldrin, andrin, dieldrin, etc., that caused the bird deaths on Lake Apopka. Why is that important? Organochlorine pesticides are persistent organic pollutants. Basically, they don't go away. They bind to the sediment, and in human beings, they're stored in fatty tissue in our bodies. Oftentimes, the breakdown products of these chemicals, like DDT, the breakdown products are even worse, even more toxic than the original pesticide itself. I know this isn't happy stuff. And people usually get really upset when they hear me say all these things, because it really applies to all of us. So the farms closed in 1998. Some 3,000 farm workers lost their jobs when the farms closed. At that time, if 3,000 auto workers in Detroit had lost their jobs, it would have gotten national attention, but it was 3,000 farm workers that lost their jobs. If alligators have birth defects and endocrine disruption and low reproductive rates and other problems from exposure to DDT and other pesticides, if organochlorine pesticides cause birds to die on Lake Apopka, what about the health of farm workers that work day after day, year after year, sometimes for several generations on Lake Apopka, who were exposed to the same pesticides as the alligators and the birds, and they were exposed consistently and regularly? If you haven't noticed yet, I'm very passionate about this. I know these people personally, and I know the health problems that they're suffering. So it's personal for me. Geraldine today is in dialysis because she has kidney failure. We have high incidence of lupus among the farm workers that used to work on Lake Apopka. It's a gross injustice because at the time that most of the African American farm workers were working on Lake Apopka, there were no regulations by the EPA to protect farm workers from pesticide exposure. Those regulations weren't passed until 1974, and even in 1974, they were very weak regulations. We didn't really get a stronger regulation, you ready for this? Until 1995. Workers worked out there with no hand washing water, no bathrooms, and planes would fly overhead and spray them directly, and nobody ever told them. They would bring home pesticide barrels and use them for barbecue grills, They would come home with pesticides on their clothes and wash them with their family's clothes. Even farm workers who didn't work on the farms, if it was a mother with 10 kids at home, she washed everybody's laundry and she got exposed to pesticides. So environment, public health, environmental justice, they're all connected. And our connection, everybody in this room most likely eats. If you eat, you should thank a farm worker that you have the food to eat. And farm workers risk their lives every day, even though we have, and I could talk a lot about pesticides because it's my passion. So we don't have the organochlorine pesticides anymore because they are banned, but we have new classes of pesticides, organophosphates. There's a whole class of organophosphate pesticides now that we thought were much safer than organochlorines. We know now that organophosphates can cause Parkinson's disease as a chronic long-term effect. Short-term, well, actually long-term, the parents that are exposed to organophosphate pesticides it could cause ADHD and learning disabilities in children. I've seen it with farm workers that I work with. And so, in conclusion, we need to change. First of all, we need to address the environment and public health because we're all affected. Second of all, we need to change the way we do agriculture in this country and move away from using pesticides. And we need to protect the most vulnerable people. And in this case, especially farm workers, because we all depend on them for the food we eat. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.